1873. Colorado Territory. Half-breed trash, Marcus Dalton snarled at his own daughter, shoving her toward the door with a look of pure disgust. But the bearded mountain man who'd been watching from the trading post stepped forward and said, "5 words that would change everything. She's twice the woman I need." What could make a father turn against his own blood? And what did this stranger see in her that her own family couldn't? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the smell of pine and wood smoke through the streets of Timber Ridge, a rough settlement clinging to the eastern slopes of the Colorado Rockies. Sarah Dalton pressed herself against the wall of Hutchinson's General Store, her fingers clutching a worn basket containing 3 measly potatoes and a handful of dried beans. Inside, she could hear the voices, her father's deep baritone cutting through the morning air like an axe through timber. "I don't care what the Reverend says about Christian charity," Marcus Dalton's voice boomed. "That girl's mother was Arapaho, and every time I look at her, I see the mistake I made 20 winters ago." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard these words before, variations of them, whispered behind her back or spat in her face. But hearing them from her father's own mouth, spoken so casually to the shopkeeper, as if she were no more than a bad investment, still had the power to cut deep. "Now, Marcus," Mr. Hutchinson replied, his tone diplomatic but uneasy. "The girl works hard. Everyone can see that. She's been helping your ranch, helping?" Her father's laugh was bitter. "She's a constant reminder of my shame. When Claire came down from Boston to marry me, she expected a respectable rancher, not a man with a half-breed bastard eating at his table. My wife can barely stand to look at her." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. Claire Dalton, her stepmother of 5 years, had never hidden her disdain. But there was something particularly painful about hearing her father defend that hatred, as if it were justified, as if Sarah's very existence was an affront to polite society. She'd been born in the winter of 1853, during one of the coldest seasons the territory had ever seen. Her mother, Nesota, twin in the Arapaho tongue, had died, bringing her into the world. The midwife told her once, during a rare moment of kindness, that her mother had smiled when she'd seen Sarah's face, had whispered something in her native language before the light left her eyes. Sarah had never learned what those final words were. Her father had forbidden anyone from speaking of Nesota, as if erasing her from memory could somehow erase the evidence of their union. "I'm telling you, Hutchinson," her father continued, "I'm done. When she turns 21 next month, she's out. I've given her more than most men would. She can find her own way. Where will she go, Marcus? You know how people treat girls like her. Without family, without protection. Not my concern anymore." The sound of coins hitting the counter rang out. "Now give me that tobacco, and we'll speak no more of it." Sarah didn't wait to hear the rest. She pushed away from the wall and hurried down the dirt street, her moccasins hand-sewn from deerskin, one of the few skills her mother's sister had taught her before disappearing back into the mountains silent on the packed earth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from exertion but from the crushing weight of finality in her father's words. 20 years old, and she'd never known a day of true belonging. At the ranch, she was tolerated at best. In town, she was either ignored or met with suspicious glares. The white women clutched their children closer when she passed. The men looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, as if they couldn't decide whether she was exotic or repulsive. Even the Arapaho, when they came to trade, regarded her with distant pity. She was too white for them, too disconnected from the old ways, a child caught between 2 worlds and welcomed by neither. She made her way past the blacksmith's forge, where Henry Coleman was hammering out horseshoes, sparks flying with each strike. He looked up, his weathered face breaking into what might have been a smile if not for the tobacco stain on his teeth. "Morning, Miss Sarah," he called out, one of the few people in town who bothered with courtesy. "Morning, Mr. Coleman," she replied softly, not breaking stride. "You tell your pa that the mare he brought in last week is ready." Threw 2 new shoes on her. "Sounds like $1 now." She nodded but didn't slow down. Let her father come fetch his own horse. She was done being his errand girl, his invisible servant, the ghost haunting the edges of his respectable life. The trail up to Widow's Peak was steep and rocky, but Sarah had walked it 100 times. It was the one place she could breathe, where the weight of other people's judgment couldn't reach her. From the top, she could see the entire valley spread out below Timber Ridge with its handful of buildings, the Dalton Ranch in the distance. And beyond that, the endless expanse of mountains and forest that stretched all the way to the setting sun. She sat on the flat boulder that overlooked the valley and finally let the tears come. They were angry tears, frustrated tears, the kind that left her gasping and exhausted. What had she done to deserve this? She worked harder than anyone at the ranch. She rose before dawn to milk the cows, tend the chickens, mend fences, and prepare meals that her stepmother would pick at with a disgusted expression. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, and still it wasn't enough. Never seen someone cry so quiet before. Sarah's head snapped up, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept at her belt. A man stood about 15 feet away, partially hidden by the shadow of a pine tree. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that had gone mostly gray. His clothes were buckskin, worn and weathered, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent more time in the wilderness than in civilization. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Name's Jacob Thorne. Been watching you come up here for about a week now. Figured you liked your solitude, but today you looked like you might need someone to tell you it gets better." "Does it?" Sarah asked, not bothering to wipe her face. What was the point of dignity when you had nothing left to lose? Jacob moved closer, settling himself on a rock across from her. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his hairline, the way his hands bore the calluses of hard work. He was maybe 45, maybe 50, it was hard to tell with mountain men. The wilderness either preserved you or aged you beyond your years. "Depends on what you're measuring against," he said thoughtfully. "If you're waiting for people to change, for hearts to soften and minds to open well, you'll be waiting until the second coming. But if you're asking whether you can build something new, something that doesn't depend on what others think you deserve, then yes, it gets better." Sarah studied him with cautious eyes. "Why do you care?" "I don't particularly," he admitted with a shrug. "But I've been where you are. Different circumstances, same feeling. Like you're drowning in a river while everyone on the shore watches and calls it your fault for falling in." There was something in his voice, a recognition of pain that didn't ask for details or offer empty platitudes. Sarah found herself wanting to trust him, which was dangerous. Trust had never served her well. "I heard your pa in town this morning," Jacob continued, "at the store. Wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Marcus Dalton's got a voice that carries." Shame flooded through her, hot and bitter. "Then you know what I am." "I know what he called you," Jacob corrected. "I also know it doesn't mean a damn thing. Your worth isn't determined by who your parents were, or what some small-minded rancher thinks about bloodlines. Easy to say when you're not the one being cast out." "Cast out?" Jacob leaned back, considering. "Or set free?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so consumed by the rejection, by the loss of the only home she'd ever known, even if it had never truly welcomed her, that she hadn't considered it might be an opportunity. "I have nowhere to go," she said quietly. "No money, no skills that anyone values. What kind of freedom is that? The kind that lets you choose your own path instead of walking the one they laid out for you." Jacob pulled a piece of dried meat from his pocket and offered it to her. When she shook her head, He bit off a chunk and chewed thoughtfully. I've got a cabin about 20 miles north of here, up in the high country. Been living there for nearly 12 years now. Trap in the winter, trade in the summer, and mostly keep to myself. It's not an easy life, but it's mine. No one tells me what I'm worth. No one spits on me for being born. Why are you telling me this? Because I need help, he said simply. Winter's coming, and I'm not as young as I used to be. Could use someone to help with the trapping. Someone to watch the cabin when I'm out on the line. Someone who knows which plants heal and which ones kill. Heard you've got a way with herbs. Learned from your mother's people. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You've been asking about me. I've been listening, Jacob corrected. There's a difference. And what I've heard tells me you're tougher than you look. Smarter than you've been given credit for. And probably mean with a rifle when you need to be. I've never shot anything bigger than a rabbit. Then it's time you learned. He stood up, dusting off his pants. Think about it. I'll be at the trading post tomorrow at noon. If you want a new life, one where you don't have to apologize for existing, meet me there. If not, I'll move on and you can figure out your own way forward. He started to walk away, then paused and turned back. One more thing. Your pa called you half-breed trash. Load of horseshit, if you ask me. Way I see it, you got the best of both worlds. Your mother's people knew how to survive in this country before the rest of us showed up with our fool ideas about civilization. Your father's people, well, they brought steel and gunpowder and a stubborn refusal to quit. You put those together, you don't get trash. You get someone who can thrive where others just barely survive. Sarah watched him disappear into the tree line, her mind reeling. It was insane. She didn't know this man. He could be a criminal, a madman, or worse. Running off with a stranger. Into the mountains was the kind of decision that got young women killed or worse. But what was the alternative? Stay at the ranch for another month, enduring her stepmother's cold silences and her father's barely concealed disgust, only to be thrown out on her 21st birthday with nothing but the clothes on her back? Try to find work in Timber Ridge where every door would close in her face? Throw herself on the mercy of the church, become some charity case for people who'd never see her as fully human? She looked down at the valley, at the life she'd never truly been part of, and felt something shift inside her chest. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. The walk back to the ranch took longer than usual. Sarah moved slowly, her mind churning through possibilities and consequences. By the time she reached the weathered wooden gate that marked the entrance to Dalton property, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The ranch house sat squat and sturdy, built from local timber and river stone. Smoke rose from the chimney, meaning Claire was inside preparing dinner. Sarah could picture her stepmother moving around the kitchen with that pinched expression, as if the very act of cooking in a house that contained Sarah was a personal affront. She headed to the barn instead, seeking the comfort of the animals. The horses nickered softly as she entered, recognizing her step. She moved down the line, checking water troughs and hay nets, her hands working automatically while her mind wandered. Thunder, her father's prize stallion, pushed his nose against her shoulder, and she rubbed his neck absently. "What do you think, boy?" she whispered. "Should I trust a stranger with kind words and empty promises?" The horse snorted, which she chose to interpret as sage advice. "Sarah!" Her father's voice cut through the peaceful silence of the barn. "Get in the house. Your stepmother needs help with dinner." She turned to find him standing in the doorway, backlit by the fading sun. Marcus Dalton was a big man, broad and strong from years of ranch work, with hair that had once been dark but was now streaked with gray. He'd been handsome once, Sarah imagined, the kind of man who could charm an Arapaho woman during a lonely winter and then marry a lost-in socialite 5 years later without blinking. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, moving toward the door. He didn't. Step aside as she approached, forcing her to squeeze past him. As she did, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "I meant what I said to Hutchinson this morning," he said, his voice low. "Next month, you're gone. I've done my duty by you more than most men would. Time you made your own way." Sarah met his eyes, seeing in them nothing but cold determination. No love, no regret, no acknowledgement that she was his daughter, his blood, the result of a choice he'd made 2 decades ago. "I understand," she said, and perhaps there was something in her tone, a new steadiness, a lack of the usual fear, because his grip loosened slightly. "Good," he released her arm. "Now go help Claire before she burns the potatoes again and blames you for distracting her." Inside, the house smelled of burned bread and boiled vegetables. Claire Dalton stood at the stove, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face flushed from the heat. She was pretty in a brittle way, like porcelain that might crack under too much pressure. "You're late," Claire said without turning around. "Set the table. And use the old plates, not the good china." Sarah did as she was told, moving through the familiar routine. The old plates, she'd learned years ago, were for her. Claire and Marcus ate from the good china, a wedding gift from Claire's family in Boston. Sarah got the chipped stoneware, as if even the dishes knew she didn't belong. Dinner was a silent affair, as it always was. Marcus ate quickly, his attention on the food rather than his family. Claire picked at her meal, occasionally shooting sharp glances at Sarah, as if daring her to speak. Sarah kept her eyes down, her mind elsewhere up in the mountains, in a cabin she'd never seen, with a man she'd just met who'd offered her something no one else ever had. A choice. After the dishes were washed and put away, Sarah retreated to her small room at the back of the house. It had once been a storage closet, barely big enough for a narrow bed and a wooden chest that held her few possessions. She lit the oil lamp and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling out the only thing she had from her mother, a small medicine pouch made of soft leather, decorated with beadwork in blue and white. Inside were dried herbs and roots, their purposes mostly forgotten, though she'd managed to learn a few through trial and error. She held the pouch to her chest and made her decision that tomorrow at noon she would meet Jacob Thorne at the trading post. She would leave behind the only life she'd ever known, trade certainty for possibility, and step into a future that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. For the first time in 20 years, Sarah Dalton would choose her own path, and if it led to disaster, at least it would be a disaster of her own making. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah woke before dawn, as she always did. The rooster hadn't even started his morning crowing when she slipped out of bed and dressed in the darkness. Her hands moved automatically, buckskin skirt, cotton shirt, the leather vest she'd patched a dozen times. But this morning was different. This morning, she was packing that, she moved silently, folding the few items she owned into a roll, an extra shirt, wool stockings for winter, the deerskin dress her aunt had given her before vanishing back to her people. Her fingers lingered on that dress. It was beautiful work, soft as butter, decorated with quillwork and patterns that told stories she'd never learned to read. Wearing it in Timber Ridge would have invited mockery, but perhaps in the high country, it would simply be practical. The medicine pouch went into her pocket, close to her heart. Everything else she owned: a hairbrush with missing bristles, a dented tin cup, a book of psalms the Reverend had given her when she was 12 she left behind. They were artifacts of a life that had never truly been hers. She completed her morning chores with mechanical efficiency. The cows didn't care that this was her last time milking them. The chickens still needed feeding. The water still needed hauling from the well. If she was going to leave, she'd leave with her conscience clear, owing nothing to anyone. Claire emerged from the bedroom just as Sarah was finishing breakfast. Her stepmother paused in the doorway. surprised to find the table already set, coffee already brewing, bread already sliced. "You're up early," Claire said suspiciously, as if industriousness itself were a crime. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah replied. Which was true enough. Claire poured herself coffee and sat down, studying Sarah with narrowed eyes. "You look different today." "Do I?" "Your face. Usually you look like a kicked dog. Today you look—" Claire struggled for the word. "Defiant." Sarah met her stepmother's gaze steadily. "Maybe I'm tired of being kicked." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Claire's jaw tightened, her knuckles white around her coffee cup. For a moment, Sarah thought she might actually respond, might acknowledge 5 years of cruelty with something resembling honesty. Instead, Claire simply said, "Marcus will be out checking the north fence today. He won't be back until evening." It wasn't permission, exactly. But it was information, and information was opportunity. "I have errands in town," Sarah said. "Take your time," Claire replied, her voice light with false sweetness. "Heaven knows we could use a day of peace around here." Sarah walked out without another word. Behind her, she heard Claire call out, "And don't expect supper if you're late." But there was no heat in it, just the reflexive meanness of someone who'd forgotten how to be anything else. The morning was cold, with frost still clinging to the grass. Sarah's breath misted in front of her as she made her way down the dirt road toward Timber Ridge. She'd tied her few possessions into a bundle and hidden it behind the smokehouse. She'd retrieve it after meeting with Jacob if she decided to go with him. Part of her still wasn't sure. The town was quiet at this hour. Most folks were just starting their day, smoke beginning to rise from chimneys as families prepared breakfast. Sarah passed the church where Reverend Thomas would soon be preparing Sunday's sermon. He'd always been kind to her in that distant, dutiful way religious men have with the unfortunate. She wondered if he'd noticed she was gone. Probably not for weeks, until someone mentioned it at service. And even then he'd likely just offer a sad prayer and move on to more pressing spiritual concerns. The trading post stood at the center of town. A large log building that served as general store, post office, and social hub. Even at this early hour, several men were gathered on the front porch, drinking coffee and sharing news. Sarah recognized most of them Tom Barrett, who ran the livery. Old Pete Sanderson, who prospected in the hills and usually came away with nothing but stories. And Douglas Finch, who owned the sawmill and had a reputation for cheating his workers. They stopped talking when they saw her approach. It was always like this, the sudden silence, the measuring looks. The way they seemed to be calculating whether to acknowledge her existence or pretend she was invisible. "Morning," she said. Keeping her voice neutral, Tom Barrett nodded. Pete gave her a gap-toothed smile. Douglas Finch just stared, his expression unreadable. "Your pa know you're in town?" Finch asked. "I don't need my father's permission to buy supplies," Sarah replied. "That so?" Finch took a step closer. "Heard interesting news yesterday. Heard Marcus is finally cutting you loose. About time, if you ask me. Man shouldn't have to support another man's mistakes." Sarah's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "Good thing nobody asked you, Mr. Finch." She moved past them into the store, her heart pounding. Behind her, she heard Finch's low chuckle and Pete's murmured, "Leave the girl alone, Douglas. She's got enough troubles." Inside, the trading post was dim and cool. Crowded with barrels of flour and sugar, shelves lined with canned goods. Tools hanging from the ceiling. Mr. Hutchinson stood behind the counter, sorting through a shipment of tobacco tins. He looked up when Sarah entered, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Miss Sarah, didn't expect to see you today." "Just need a few things," she said, though she wasn't sure what. Her mind was spinning, racing ahead to noon, to the decision she still hadn't fully made. Hutchinson set down his work and came around the counter. "Listen, about what your father said yesterday. I don't want to talk about it. Fair enough. But I want you to know, if you need help, if you need work, my wife could use someone at the house. The pay wouldn't be much, but it'd be honest work and a place to sleep. The kindness in his voice was almost harder to bear than Finch's cruelty. Sarah blinked back sudden tears. That's generous of you, Mr. Hutchinson, but I don't think Mrs. Hutchinson would appreciate having someone like me in her home. My wife, Hutchinson said firmly, is a good Christian woman who believes in helping those in need. You just say the word. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She wandered the aisles, picking up items at random: a bar of soap, a tin of matches, a length of rope, things that might be useful in the mountains. If she went, if she had the courage, the store gradually filled with morning shoppers. Martha Green came in with her 2 young daughters, both of whom stared at Sarah with wide, curious eyes until their mother hushed them. Frank Morrison stopped by for pipe tobacco and gave Sarah a curt nod, which was more courtesy than most offered. Through the window, she watched the sun climb higher, measuring time by shadows and her own accelerating heartbeat. At 11:30. She paid for her purchases with the few coins she'd saved from selling eggs. Hutchinson gave her extra matches and a block of salt, waving away her protests. Consider it a gift, he said quietly. She stepped back outside, where the morning had warmed into a pleasant autumn day. The men on the porch had dispersed, gone about their business. The street was busier now, with wagons rolling past and women carrying baskets too, and, from the various shops, Sarah found a spot near the water trough and waited. Her bundle was still hidden behind the smokehouse at the ranch, but she could always retrieve it. Or not. She could still walk away, accept Hutchinson's offer, build a quiet life of servitude and gratitude. It would be safe. It would be respectable. It would be a slow death of everything she might have been. At 5 minutes to noon, Jacob Thorne appeared at the far end of the street. He walked with the easy gait of a man comfortable in his own skin, unbothered by the stares that followed him. Mountain men weren't uncommon in Timber Ridge, but they usually came down only for supplies and whiskey, staying just long enough to conduct business before retreating to solitude. Jacob moved through the town as if he belonged here as much as anyone. Which was to say, not particularly. He spotted her and changed direction, his weathered face breaking into something that might have been relief. Wasn't sure you'd come, he said when he reached her. I wasn't sure either, Sarah admitted. Jacob pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Made you a list. Things you'll need for the winter. I can provide most of it, cabin's well stocked, but thought you might want to pick out your own gear. Boots especially. Can't have you trudging through snow in moccasins, no matter how well made. Sarah took the list, scanning the items. Wool coat, oiled canvas rain slicker, leather gloves, sturdy boots, ammunition for a rifle, traps and snares. It read like a catalog for a completely different life. This will cost a fortune, she said. Already taken care of. Jacob nodded toward his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa tied near the trading post. Made good money on last year's furs. And before you get proud on me, consider it an investment. You can't work if you freeze to death in November. I haven't said yes yet, I know. Jacob leaned against the water trough, his blue eyes studying her carefully. So what's stopping you? Sarah folded the list, creasing it along lines that were already there, as if he'd done this same thing many times while deciding what to write. I don't know you. You could be anyone. You could be dangerous? Jacob finished. I could be. But so is staying here. Different kind of danger, maybe, but danger all the same. Sometimes the devil you don't know is better than the one you do. That's not how the saying goes. Maybe it should be. He straightened up. Look, I'm not going to pressure you. You want references, I can give you names. Spent 3 years trapping with Bill Garrett before he retired to Oregon. Traded with the northern Arapaho for nearly a decade, you ask for man who walks far. Tell him Jacob sends greetings, he'll vouch for me. I'm not a saint, but I'm not a monster either. I'm just a man who keeps his word and respects an honest day's work. Sarah watched a tumbleweed roll down the street, pushed by the mountain breeze. Somewhere in town, a dog barked. A baby cried. Life continued on its predictable path, everyone following the roads laid out before them, rarely questioning if those roads led anywhere worth going. My father said I'm half-breed trash, she said quietly. You said I'm twice the woman you need. Which one of you is lying? Jacob considered this seriously. Neither of us, probably. Your father sees what he wants to see, a reminder of his own weakness, proof he once acted on desire instead of propriety. Makes him feel small, so he tries to make you smaller. As for me, I see someone who survived 20 years in a place that didn't want her. That takes strength most people never have to develop. Twice the woman I need? Maybe that was generous. Maybe you're 3 times, 4 times. But I figure saying it that way sounded better. Despite everything, Sarah felt a smile tug at her lips. You're very sure of yourself. No, Jacob said. I'm very sure of you. There's a difference. A wagon rolled past, driven by the Reverend Thomas himself. He raised a hand in greeting, his expression puzzled at seeing Sarah talking to a mountain man. She waved back, wondering what he'd think when he learned she'd left. Would he pray for her soul? Probably. Would he understand? Probably not. I need to get something, Sarah said suddenly. My things. They're at the ranch. I'll come with you. No, she shook her head. My father's out, but if he comes back early and finds you there, then he'll have to go through me to get to you, Jacob said simply. And I promise you, girl, I don't go down easy. They rode together, Sarah sitting behind Jacob on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist to keep from falling. She'd ridden before, but never like this, never at this speed, never with such complete trust in someone she barely knew. The wind whipped her hair back, and she found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The ranch appeared in the distance, and Sarah's laughter died. What if her father had returned early? What if Claire had sent word to him somehow? But the yard was empty when they arrived, no sign of Marcus or his horse. Wait here, Sarah said, sliding down from the Appaloosa. 5 minutes, Jacob replied. Then I'm coming in. She retrieved her bundle from behind the smokehouse, then slipped into the house through the back door. Claire was nowhere to be seen, probably in town herself, gossiping with the other wives about the shameful half-breed girl, who would soon be someone else's problem. In her tiny room, Sarah took one last look around. There was nothing here she wanted to keep, nothing that held value beyond the bare function of survival. This had never been a home. It had been a prison where she was guilty of the crime of existing. She pulled out a scrap of paper and a pencil, thought for a moment, then wrote, "Gone to make my own way. Don't look for me." She left it on the kitchen table where her father would find it. Weighted down with the tin cup she no longer needed. Then Sarah Dalton walked out of her father's house for the last time. Jacob was exactly where she'd left him, though his hand rested on the rifle across his saddle, his eyes scanning the horizon. When he saw her, his posture relaxed. Ready? He asked. Sarah tied her bundle to the saddle, then looked back at the ranch one final time. The house, the barn, the fields where she'd worked herself to exhaustion for people who'd never see her as anything more than an obligation. She waited for sadness, for regret, for some sense of loss. Instead, she felt light, free, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Ready, she said, and climbed back up behind him. They rode north, toward the mountains, toward winter, toward a future as uncertain as the weather. Behind them, Timber Ridge grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon. a place where she'd survived but never lived. Ahead, the peaks rose sharp against the blue sky, beautiful and dangerous, promising nothing except the opportunity to become whoever she chose to be. Sarah held tight to Jacob's coat and didn't look back again. The trail climbed steadily upward, leaving behind the gentler slopes where ranchers grazed cattle and homesteaders cleared land. Here, the wilderness asserted itself with ancient authority. Ponderosa pines towering overhead, their needles carpeting the ground in thick layers that muffled the horses' hoofbeats. The air grew thinner, crisper, carrying the scent of sage and wild mint. Jacob navigated the terrain with practiced ease, guiding his horse around washouts and fallen timber without seeming to think about it. Occasionally he'd point out landmarks, a lightning-struck tree that marked the turnoff to a spring, a peculiar rock formation that meant they were halfway to the ridgeline, a meadow where elk gathered in the early morning. "You'll need to learn about this country," he said over his shoulder. "Maps are useless up here. The land changes every season, avalanches in spring, forest fires in summer, snow that rewrites everything come winter. You navigate by memory and instinct." Sarah absorbed this information silently, her eyes taking in everything. She'd spent her whole life in the shadow of these mountains, but had never ventured this deep. The world she knew, with its fences and roads and neat divisions of property, felt impossibly distant now, as if it belonged to someone else's story entirely. They stopped at a creek to water the horse and rest. Jacob pulled dried venison and hardtack from his saddlebag, offering half to Sarah. She discovered she was ravenous, having eaten nothing since the bread she'd left on her father's table that morning. Had that really been only hours ago? It felt like years. How much farther? She asked between bites. 4, maybe 5 hours if we keep good pace. Jacob chewed thoughtfully, his gaze distant. "We'll make it before dark. Get you settled. Tomorrow I'll start teaching you what you need to know. And if I'm no good at it, trapping, I mean, then you'll get good. Or you'll find something else you're better at." He took a long drink from his canteen. People think survival is about being strong or tough. It's not. It's about being adaptable. You'll figure it out. They crossed into aspen groves where the leaves had turned gold, creating cathedral-like spaces filled with amber light. Sarah had never seen anything so beautiful. She'd worked too hard, been too focused on survival, to notice beauty before. Now it surrounded her, vast and indifferent and utterly magnificent. "Your mother," Jacob said suddenly. "What do you know about her?" The question caught Sarah off guard. People in Timber Ridge never asked about Nashotah. It was an unspoken rule, as if mentioning her might somehow make Sarah's mixed heritage more real, more present. "Not much," Sarah admitted. "My father wouldn't speak of her. I know she was a Arapaho. I know she died when I was born. My aunt, my mother's sister, visited once when I was 7 or 8. She stayed 3 days, taught me some things, then left in the middle of the night. Haven't seen her since. What did she teach you? How to tan hides. Which plants could be used for medicine. A few words in her language, though I've forgotten most of them." Sarah paused, remembering those brief days with painful clarity. Her aunt had been stern, efficient, showing no particular affection, but no cruelty either. Just practical knowledge passed down like any other skill. "She told me my mother was a healer, that people came from other tribes to seek her wisdom. That's a gift," Jacob said. "Healing. Knowing which plants help and which harm. Up here, that knowledge keeps people alive. My stepmother called it witchcraft. Your stepmother's a fool." Jacob's tone was matter of fact, not cruel. No offense intended, none taken. They climbed higher, the trail becoming steeper and rockier. Sarah's legs ached from gripping the horse, her arms tired from holding onto Jacob's coat. But she didn't complain. Complaining had never changed anything at the ranch. It certainly wouldn't help here. The sun was low on the horizon when they crested a final ridge, and Sarah saw it a valley tucked between peaks. Small and sheltered, with a creek running through its center. At the far end stood a cabin, solid and weathered, smoke rising from its chimney. "Wait," Sarah said. "Someone's there." "My partner. Name's Ben Whitaker. He's been watching the place while I was in town." Jacob urged the horse forward. "Don't worry, Ben's good people. Little rough around the edges, but he minds his business and pulls his weight." As they descended into the valley, Sarah could make out more details. There was a small barn, a smokehouse, animal pens, a large garden plot that had been put to bed for winter. Everything spoke of careful maintenance and hard work. This wasn't some temporary camp, this was a homestead. Figure emerged from the cabin, a lean man with dark skin and graying hair, wearing buckskins similar to Jacob's. He watched their approach with crossed arms. His expression unreadable. "That's the help you went looking for." Ben called out when they were within earshot. "A slip of a girl who looks like a strong wind could blow her over." "This is Sarah Dalton," Jacob said, bringing the horse to a stop. "She's tougher than she looks. Sarah, this is Ben Whitaker. He talks too much and cheats at cards, but he's the best tracker in Colorado Territory." Ben's stern expression cracked into a grin. "Second best, you mean?" He stepped forward, offering his hand to help Sarah down. Up close, she could see the scars on his face, the way his left hand was missing 2 fingers. "Welcome to High Valley, Miss Dalton. Hope you know what you're getting into." "Not really," Sarah admitted, accepting his help. "Honest, at least." Ben released her hand and turned to Jacob. "We've got elk steaks for dinner. Shot a 4-point bull this morning down by the beaver ponds. And there's fresh bread, and not completely useless when left alone." The cabin's interior was sparse but comfortable. Handmade furniture, rough-hewn but solid. Pelts hanging from the walls for insulation. A stone fireplace dominating one wall, with a proper iron cookstove beside it. Shelves lined with supplies, flour, beans, coffee, ammunition. A table big enough for 4 people. 2 beds built into alcoves on opposite sides of the room. Sarah stood in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. Where would she sleep? The cabin had clearly been built for 2 men, not 3 people, and definitely not with any consideration for privacy. Jacob seemed to read her thoughts. "We'll string up a blanket to give you your own space. Not fancy, but it'll do until we can add a proper room come spring." "If she lasts that long," Ben said, but there was no malice in it. "Most folks from town can't handle a week up here. Too quiet. Too much work. Not enough people to tell them how special they are." "I've never been told I'm special," Sarah said quietly. "And I know how to work. We'll see." Ben moved to the stove, where the elk steaks were sizzling in a cast-iron pan. "Hope you're hungry." Jacob always comes back from town with an appetite that could feed 3 men. They ate at the table as twilight deepened into night outside. The elk was tender and flavorful, seasoned with wild herbs Sarah didn't recognize. Ben's bread was dense and filling, perfect for soaking up the meat juices. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that this might be a test of sorts, how well she fit in. Whether she'd complain about the rough conditions or the unfamiliar food. "Tell me about yourself," Ben said, leaning back in his chair. "Jacob said your father's Marcus Dalton. Big rancher down in Timber Ridge." "He is," Sarah confirmed. "I'm his daughter, but he'd prefer people forgot that particular fact. Because of your mother?" Sarah met his eyes, looking for judgment and finding only curiosity. "Yes, my grandmother was Cherokee," Ben said casually. "My mother's people were from Tennessee, got pushed west during the removal. My father was a free black man who worked the riverboats. I grew up caught between 3 worlds, not quite belonging to any of them. Came to the mountains because nobody up here cares about bloodlines. They care about whether you can pull your weight and watch someone's back when it matters. Something tight in Sarah's chest loosened. Is that why you're here? Both of you? Part of it, Jacob said. I came west after the war. Fought for the Union, saw things that made me question whether civilization was worth preserving. Figured if I was going to survive, it'd be on my own terms, not society's. He pushed back from the table. Ben showed up about 6 years ago, half-starved and running from something he still won't talk about. And I won't start now, Ben interjected. Point is, we all got reasons for being here. Nobody judges, nobody pries. You do your work, you respect the land, and we all get through the winter alive. That's the deal. What exactly will my work be? Sarah asked. Everything, Jacob said bluntly. We run a trap line that's about 20 miles long, checking it every 3 days in winter. That's a full day's journey on snowshoes. We hunt for meat, gather firewood, maintain the cabin, preserve food, tan hides. And in summer we plant what we can in that garden plot. It's not specialized work, it's survival work. Every person does what needs doing. Can you shoot? Ben asked. Small game. Rabbits, squirrels. We'll start you on bigger targets. Deer, elk. Maybe bear if one gets too curious about our stores. Ben stood and retrieved a rifle from the wall, handing it to Sarah. This'll be yours. It's a good gun, well balanced. We'll spend tomorrow getting you comfortable with it. The rifle was heavier than Sarah expected, the woodstock worn smooth from use. She held it carefully, aware of its deadly potential. I've never killed anything large, she admitted. You will, Jacob said. And the first time's always hard. But up here, sentiment gets people killed. You respect the animal, waste nothing, take only what you need. But you don't hesitate when it's time to pull the trigger. After dinner, Jacob and Ben strung a rope across one corner of the cabin and hung heavy blankets from it, creating a small private area with just enough room for the narrow bed they dragged from storage in the barn. Sarah's new quarters had a trunk for her belongings, a hook for her clothes, and a small window that looked out toward the eastern peaks. It's not much, Jacob said apologetically. It's mine, Sarah replied, and realized that might be the most important thing. For the first time in her life, she had a space that belonged to her alone, where she didn't have to apologize for occupying it. That night, lying in her bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness wind in the pines, distant animal calls, the creek's constant murmur, Sarah felt fear and excitement warring in her chest. Tomorrow she'd begin learning skills that might keep her alive or might prove she was foolish for coming here. There was no safety net, no fallback plan. If she failed, there was nowhere to go but back to Timber Ridge, back to her father's contempt and her stepmother's cruelty. But if she succeeded, Sarah closed her eyes and thought of her mother, Nashoda the healer, who had survived in these mountains long before white settlers arrived with their fences and their judgments. Perhaps some of that strength lived in Sarah's blood. Perhaps being caught between two worlds didn't make her weak. Perhaps it made her capable of navigating territories others couldn't imagine. She fell asleep with that thought. While outside the cabin, the mountains stood silent and waiting, ready to test her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The next morning began before dawn. Sarah woke to the sound of Ben building up the fire and Jacob moving around the cabin, gathering equipment. She dressed quickly behind her curtain, braided her hair, and emerged to find both men ready to start the day. We're burning daylight, Ben said, though the sun hadn't yet risen. Get some coffee and cornmeal mush. Then we work. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, the mush bland but filling. Sarah ate standing up, aware that some test had already begun, that every moment was an evaluation of whether she belonged here. Outside, the valley was breathtaking in the early light. Frost covered everything, turning the grass silver and making the creek steam where it flowed over rocks. Sarah's breath came out in white puffs, and she was grateful for the wool coat Jacob had insisted she buy. "First lesson," Jacob said, handing her the rifle. "Loading and firing. Ben will set up targets while I teach you the basics." They spent the morning working with the rifle. Sarah's shoulder ached from the recoil. Her ears rang from the shots, but she was determined not to complain. By midday, she could hit a man-sized target at 50 yards more often than not. Jacob seemed satisfied. "You've got a steady hand," he observed. "That's half the battle. The other half is learning to shoot, when your heart's pounding and your hands are shaking, because there's a bear between you and safety. But we'll work up to that." After lunch, Ben took over her education. He led her into the forest, teaching her to read tracks: deer, elk, wolf, mountain lion. He showed her how to move quietly, how to use the wind to mask her scent, how to identify game trails and water sources. "The wilderness talks to you if you learn its language," he said, crouching beside what looked like random scratches on a tree trunk. "See this? Bear marking territory. You find fresh marks like this, you go the other way. Bears this time of year are fattening up for hibernation. They're irritable and unpredictable." Sarah absorbed everything, her mind racing to catalog all this new information. It was overwhelming and exhilarating, like learning to read in a language that had always been there, but she'd never understood. By evening, she was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical labor at her father's ranch. This was the exhaustion of constant mental engagement, of learning skills that mattered in immediate, visceral ways. At the ranch, failure meant disapproval. Here, it might mean death. That night, after another meal of wild game and bread, Jacob pulled out a map drawn on tanned hide. It showed the valley and surrounding territory, marked with symbols Sarah didn't recognize. "This is our trap line," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "Starting next week, we'll begin setting traps. You'll learn how to place them, how to check them, how to dispatch animals humanely. It's not pleasant work, but it's how we survive. The furs we take in winter, we trade in summer for supplies we can't make ourselves." "I understand," Sarah said, though part of her quailed at the thought of killing animals caught in traps. But she'd said she could work, and she meant it. "One more thing," Ben added, his expression serious. "Winter up here is dangerous. You never go out alone until you know this country like the back of your hand. You never assume the weather will hold. You never take shortcuts or get cocky. People die in these mountains every year because they forget to respect the wilderness. We need you to promise you'll follow our rules." Sarah looked at both men, Jacob with his weathered face and kind eyes, Ben with his stern demeanor that concealed genuine concern. They were trusting her with their lives as much as she was trusting them with hers. "I promise," she said. And in that moment, sitting in a rough cabin miles from civilization, eating food she'd helped prepare and learning skills she'd never imagined needing, Sarah Dalton felt something she'd never experienced at her father's ranch. She felt like she belonged. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of relentless learning and physical labor. Sarah discovered muscles she didn't know existed, each one protesting as she adapted to the demands of mountain life. Every morning brought new lessons, new skills to master, new ways her previous life had left her unprepared. Ben proved to be a demanding teacher, patient only up to the point where patience became indulgence. When Sarah struggled to properly skin a rabbit she'd shot, he watched in silence for exactly 3 minutes before taking the knife from her hands. "You're hacking at it like you're mad at the creature," he said, demonstrating the proper technique with swift, precise cuts. "The animal gave its life. Least you can do is honor that with clean work. Now try again." She did, and failed, and tried again. By the 10th rabbit, her cuts were cleaner. By the 20th, Ben merely grunted approval and walked away, which she'd learned was the highest praise he offered. Jacob's teaching style differed entirely. He explained the why behind every action, turning practical tasks into natural philosophy. While setting snares along a game trail, he'd talk about animal behavior, how prey species thought, where they felt safest moving through the forest. Trapping isn't about brute force or luck, he said, adjusting a snare's tension. It's about understanding your quarry better than they understand themselves. This trail looks random, but it's not. See how it threads between those two boulders? That's a bottleneck. Animals feel secure in narrow spaces protected on both sides. That's where you set your trap. Sarah absorbed it all like dry earth soaking up rain. At night, exhausted and aching, she'd lie in her small curtained space reviewing the day's lessons in her mind, determined not to forget a single detail. Failure wasn't an option she'd allow herself. The first snow came 3 weeks after her arrival, light flurries that dusted the valley in white powder. Sarah woke to find the world transformed, everything softened and muffled under winter's blanket. She stepped outside and found Jacob already at work, splitting firewood with methodical efficiency. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, setting down his axe. "Also deadly. By January, that pretty powder will be 10 feet deep in places. You'll need snowshoes just to check the trap line. The cold will crack trees like rifle shots. Wildlife gets scarce and desperate. That's when the real test begins." "You're trying to scare me," Sarah observed. "I'm trying to prepare you." Jacob retrieved 2 pairs of snowshoes from the barn wooden frames laced with rawhide webbing. "Time to learn how to use these. They look simple, but there's an art to walking in them. Do it wrong and you'll exhaust yourself in an hour." They spent the morning trudging through the snow-covered valley, Sarah learning the peculiar gait required to keep the snowshoes from tangling. Her thighs burned, her calves cramped, but she pushed through until the movement became almost natural. "You're a quick study," Jacob said during a rest break. "Most people take weeks to get comfortable on snowshoes. You did it in the morning. Most people probably had breakfast before starting," Sarah replied, only half joking. In his enthusiasm to begin the lesson, Jacob had dragged her out before she'd eaten. He laughed, a genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Fair point. Let's head back. Ben's probably got lunch ready, and if we're late, he'll feed ours to the dogs." They didn't have dogs. But Sarah had learned both men employed exaggeration as a form of humor. Their way of keeping spirits light during hard work. That afternoon brought Sarah's first real test. Jacob decided she was ready to check part of the trapline alone, 2-mile circuit that would take her through forest and along the creek. Ben objected. "She's been here less than a month," he argued. "What if she gets turned around? What if there's a mountain lion on one of the traps?" "Then she used what we taught her," Jacob replied calmly. "She needs to learn confidence, Ben. We can't hold her hand forever." Sarah stood silent during this debate about her competence, understanding it wasn't really about her. Ben had lost someone once. She'd overheard fragments of the story late one night when the men thought she was asleep. A younger brother, caught in an avalanche, body never recovered. Ben's protective instinct came from a place of old grief. "I'll be careful," she said quietly. "And if I'm not back by dark, you can come looking for me." Ben scowled but handed her a pack containing rope, extra ammunition, dried meat, and a compass. The trails marked with blazes on the trees, 3 slashes stacked vertical. "You see those, you're on the right path. You see anything else, you stop and think before proceeding." The forest was different alone. Every sound seemed amplified, branches creaking, snow sliding from laden boughs, the distant call of a raven. Sarah moved carefully, her rifle ready but not raised, checking each trap according to the sequence Jacob had drilled into her. The first 3 traps were empty. The 4th held a pine marten, already dead, its dark fur pristine. Sarah approached cautiously, scanning the area for larger predators that might have been drawn by the scent. Finding none, she removed the animal, reset the trap, and added the marten to her pack. The fifth trap had been sprung, but was empty. Something had stolen the bait without being caught. Sarah examined the tracks around it, recognizing the distinctive pad pattern of a fox. Clever creature. She reset the trap with fresh bait and moved on. At the sixth trap, she found trouble. A young wolf had its paw caught in the snare. Not the trap's intended target, but wildlife didn't read human intentions. The wolf snarled as Sarah approached. Its lips pulled back to reveal sharp teeth, eyes wild with pain and fear. Sarah's heart hammered. This wasn't part of the lesson. Jacob had shown her how to dispatch trapped animals quickly and humanely, but those had been demonstrations with already dead creatures. This was different. The wolf was suffering, and she was responsible for ending that suffering. She could hear Ben's voice in her head. Sentiment gets people killed. And Jacob's, respect the animal, waste nothing. But don't hesitate. Sarah raised the rifle, sighting carefully. The wolf's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something that looked almost like understanding. Then she pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest, and the wolf went still. Sarah stood there for a long moment, trembling. She'd killed rabbits, squirrels, even a deer under Jacob's supervision. But this felt different. The wolf hadn't chosen to step into that snare. It had been doing what wolves do, investigating interesting smells, following its nature. And she'd ended its life because of a trap she'd helped set. This is what survival costs, she thought. This is what it means to live here. She field-dressed the wolf with shaking hands, working carefully despite her emotional turmoil. The pelt was too young and thin to be valuable, but the meat could feed the sled dogs they'd be getting in winter. Waste nothing. She packed out what could be used and left the rest for scavengers, completing the circle. By the time she returned to the cabin, twilight was painting the valley in shades of purple and gold. Jacob and Ben were both outside, ostensibly working, but clearly watching the tree line. When they saw her emerge from the forest, something in their posture relaxed. Got turned around at Bent Creek, Sarah announced, dropping her pack. Took me 20 minutes to find the blaze markers again. But you did find them, Jacob said. It wasn't a question, eventually. Sarah pulled out the marten. One clean catch. And I had to shoot a wolf that got caught in the snare at Site 6. Ben's eyebrows rose. Young wolf? Gray with a white chest patch? Yes, that's the one that's been shadowing the trapline all week. Been a nuisance. Ben examined the wolf pelt Sarah had brought. Clean shot to the head. Quick death. You did right. The approval in his voice meant more than Sarah expected. She'd proven something today, not just to them but to herself, that night. As they ate venison stew and fresh biscuits, Jacob told stories about his early years in the mountains, mistakes he'd made, lessons learned the hard way. Near disasters that became funny only with the passage of time. First winter I spent alone, I nearly starved, he admitted. Thought I knew everything because I'd read some books about frontier living. Turns out books don't mention how hard it is to find game in deep snow. Or how much firewood you actually need to survive January. Or that mice will get into your food stores if you don't seal everything in tin. How'd you survive? Sarah asked. Luck, mostly. And a Ute hunter who found me half frozen in my cabin, took pity, and taught me what I should have learned before heading into the wilderness. Jacob refilled his coffee. Man's name was Runs Like Deer. Spent 2 months with me that winter, showing me how to actually live instead of just survive. When spring came, he went back to his people. Never saw him again, but I owed him my life. Is that why you're teaching me? Sarah asked. Paying forward what he did for you. Partly. Jacob met her eyes across the table. Also because I see potential in you that you don't see in yourself yet. You've got good instincts, strong work ethic, and you don't quit when things get hard. Those qualities are worth cultivating. Ben snorted. He's saying you're not completely useless. which, coming from Jacob, is practically a declaration of love. They all laughed, and Sarah realized with sudden clarity that this was what family should feel like. Not the tense silences and conditional acceptance of her father's house, but this easy companionship born from shared struggle and mutual respect. The following weeks brought harder challenges. Sarah learned to identify medicinal plants even under snow, guided by the knowledge her aunt had taught her and expanded by Jacob's experience. She learned to read weather signs in the clouds and animal behavior. She learned which ice on the creek was safe to cross, and which would crack under her weight. She also learned the harsh economics of mountain survival. Not every trap yielded pelts. Not every hunt was successful. There were days when they worked from dawn to dusk and had little to show for it, except exhaustion and frozen fingers, during one particularly brutal cold snap. When temperatures dropped so low that spit froze before hitting the ground, they lost a full week of trapping. The cold made the animals retreat to their dens, and checking the trapline risked frostbite for no return. They stayed in the cabin, maintaining equipment and telling stories to pass the time. "Tell me about your mother," Jacob said one evening while they were waterproofing leather boots with animal fat. Sarah's hands stilled. She'd grown comfortable with these men, but that particular wound still felt raw. "I already told you I barely knew her." "But you carry her medicine pouch," Jacob pressed gently. "That means something." Sarah pulled the small leather bag from her pocket, running her fingers over the beadwork. "My aunt gave me this when she visited. Said my mother made it when she knew I was coming, that she filled it with herbs to protect me. I don't even know what half of them are anymore. May I?" Ben asked, holding out his hand. Sarah hesitated, then passed him the pouch. Ben opened it carefully, spreading the contents on the table. Dried roots, withered leaves, small pouches of powder. He examined each item with surprising knowledge. "This is yarrow stops bleeding," he said, pointing to dried white flowers. "This is sage for purification and fever. This powder here is ground willow bark, better than laudanum for pain. And this," he held up a twisted root, "this is osha. Powerful medicine. Good for respiratory illness, protection against evil spirits if you believe in such things. How do you know all this?" Sarah asked, amazed. "My grandmother was a healer," Ben said quietly. "Before the removal, before everything changed, she taught me some of the old ways. Not as much as I should have learned, but enough to recognize what your mother left you." He carefully returned everything to the pouch and handed it back. "She gave you tools for survival, Sarah, physical and spiritual. That's not nothing." That night, lying in her bed, Sarah thought about her mother in a new way. Not as an abstract figure of loss and shame, but as a woman who'd known she might not survive childbirth, and had still tried to protect her daughter in the only way she could. The medicine pouch wasn't just a keepsake, it was a legacy. Passed from mother to daughter across the chasm of death. Sarah fell asleep clutching the pouch. And for the first time since leaving Timber Ridge, she dreamed of her mother. In the dream, Nashota was young and strong, gathering herbs in a mountain meadow very much like the valley where Sarah now lived. She looked up and smiled, not the sad, distant smile Sarah had always imagined, but something warm and knowing, as if she'd seen this future and approved. When Sarah woke, she found herself crying, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of connection, of understanding that she wasn't alone, that she carried her mother's strength in more than just blood. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. Another day of hard work awaited. Another opportunity to prove she belonged here, in this wild, beautiful, dangerous place. Sarah dressed quickly and emerged from behind her curtain to find Jacob already stoking the fire. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I have in years," Sarah replied honestly. Jacob smiled. "Good, because today we're teaching you to handle the big traps, the ones we use for wolverine and mountain lion. They're dangerous to set, and if you do it wrong, you'll lose fingers. Maybe a hand. Sounds delightful, Sarah said dryly. That's the spirit. Jacob handed her a cup of coffee. Drink up. It's going to be a long day. And it was. But Sarah faced it with something she'd never had before. The certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. December arrived with deceptive calm. Clear skies stretched endlessly blue, and the temperature, while cold, remained manageable. Sarah had settled into the rhythm of mountain life wake before dawn. Check the trapline, process whatever they'd caught, maintain equipment, prepare for the deeper winter ahead. Her hands had grown calloused, her aim steady, her movements through the forest confident. She'd stopped thinking about Timber Ridge entirely. The ranch, her father, the townspeople who'd looked at her with contempt, they belonged to someone else's life now. Sometimes, late at night, she'd wonder if Marcus had even noticed she was gone, or if her absence had simply been absorbed into the household like one less chore to worry about. "You're getting too comfortable," Ben said one morning as they worked together repairing a section of the smokehouse roof. "That's when the mountains remind you who's really in charge." "Superstitious nonsense," Sarah replied. Hammering a nail into place, Ben gave her a look that suggested she'd just said something profoundly stupid. "You'll learn." 2 days later, she learned. The sky changed overnight from crystalline blue to a peculiar yellow-gray that made the hair on Sarah's neck stand up. The air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't name. The horses were restless in their stalls, and even the chickens seemed agitated, refusing to leave their coop despite scattered feed. Jacob stood outside the cabin, studying the sky with a grim expression. "Big storm is coming." "Maybe the biggest I've seen in 5 years. How big?" Sarah asked. "The kind that buries the valley under 20 feet of snow and keeps us trapped for a week or more." He turned to her, his face serious. "We need to bring in every scrap of firewood we can carry. Check all the animals, make sure nothing's left outside that we might need. Once this hits, we won't be able to see 5 feet in front of our faces." They worked with frantic urgency, hauling wood until Sarah's arms trembled with exhaustion. Ben secured the barn, reinforcing weak points and ensuring the animals had enough feed and water to last. Jacob checked and double-checked their food stores, counting cans and sacks with the precision of a banker tallying gold. The first flakes began falling just after noon fat, lazy flakes that drifted down like feathers. Within an hour, they'd transformed into a solid wall of white, driven horizontal by wind that howled like a living thing. The temperature plummeted so fast Sarah could feel it through the cabin walls despite the roaring fire. "This is it," Jacob announced, barring the door. "Nobody goes outside for any reason unless the cabin's on fire." "Understood?" They huddled inside as the storm raged. The wind screamed around the cabin, finding every crack and gap, sending icy drafts swirling through the room despite their preparations. Snow piled against the walls, climbing higher until the windows were half buried. The world outside disappeared entirely, reduced to a white void of violent motion. On the second day, the chimney began backing up, filling the cabin with smoke. Ben had to climb onto the roof, nearly invisible in the blizzard, tethered by rope, to clear the snow that was blocking the flue. He came back inside half frozen, his beard solid ice, his hands so cold he couldn't feel them. Sarah boiled water and soaked cloths, wrapping his hands carefully while Jacob built up the fire. "You could have lost your fingers out there," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "Better than losing the cabin to fire," Ben replied through chattering teeth. "We do what needs doing." The storm lasted 6 days. 6 days of howling wind and endless snow, of rationing firewood and food, of watching supplies dwindle and hoping they'd calculated correctly. The cabin felt smaller with each passing day, the walls pressing in, tempers growing short from confinement and worry. On the 4th night, they heard something massive slam against the barn. The crash was loud enough to cut through the storm's roar, followed by the sound of splintering wood. "The roof," Jacob said, already pulling on his coat. "It's collapsing under the weight of the snow." "You can't go out there," Sarah protested. "You'll die before you reach the barn. And the horses will die if that roof comes down." Jacob tied a rope around his waist. "Ben, you anchor me." "Sarah, keep this fire going. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, pull me in whether I'm done or not." He disappeared into the white chaos, the rope playing out behind him as he fought his way toward the barn. Sarah and Ben watched the rope, counting seconds that felt like hours. The wind tried to tear the door from their hands every time it gusted. 15 minutes passed. 18. At 19 minutes. The rope went slack. "No," Sarah breathed. Ben was already hauling on the rope. Hand over hand, his face set in concentration. Sarah joined him, pulling with all her strength. The rope was heavy, heavier than it should be with just one man attached. Jacob came through the door in a rush, covered in snow, gasping for breath. Behind him, guided by the rope, came both horses, Thunder and Ismare, their eyes rolling white with fear. "Roof's down," Jacob managed between breaths. "Had to get them out." They crammed the horses into the cabin's main room, which suddenly felt impossibly small. The animals were panicked, their hooves loud on the wooden floor, their breath steaming. But they were alive, and the cabin, though crowded, was intact. "You're insane," Ben said flatly. "Probably," Jacob agreed. "But we're going to need those horses come spring. And I wasn't leaving them to be crushed." They spent the rest of the storm living in close quarters with 2 frightened horses, the smell of animal and smoke and unwashed humans becoming overwhelming. But they survived. That was what mattered. When the storm finally broke on the morning of the 7th day, the silence was almost painful. Sarah opened the door to find a transformed world. Snow had buried everything. The barn was just a vague mound, the woodpile completely hidden, the paths they'd worn through the valley obliterated. The sky above was painfully blue, the sun brilliant on the endless white. "Well," Ben said, looking at the devastation, "this will be fun to dig out." It took 3 days to excavate enough to function. They tunneled to the barn, shored up what remained of the roof, created paths between the essential structures. Sarah's back screamed from shoveling, her hands blistered despite gloves. But the work had to be done. On the 4th day, while digging out the smokehouse, Sarah's shovel struck something that wasn't snow. She cleared away more, revealing a dead elk partially buried by the storm. It had sought shelter near the building and been caught by the blizzard, freezing to death within feet of potential salvation. "That's a blessing," Jacob said when she called him over. "Fresh meat we didn't have to hunt. The cold kept it preserved. We'll butcher it today before scavengers find it." They worked through the afternoon, processing the elk. Sarah had butchered dozens of animals by now, but never anything this large. Jacob and Ben showed her how to work efficiently, how to separate the meat into portions for different uses: roasts, steaks, stewing meat, scraps for rendering fat. "Nothing gets wasted," Jacob reminded her as they worked. "The hide becomes leather. The bones make tools and broth. The sinew becomes thread. Even the organs have value: liver's good eating, heart's better. You take from the land, you use everything it gives you." As the sun set, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of rose and gold, they finished their work. The smokehouse was full, the meat hanging to cure. They'd gained weeks of food from an animal that had died regardless of their actions. Sarah understood now what Jacob meant about respecting nature while accepting its harsh realities. That night, exhausted but satisfied, they sat around the fire eating fresh elk liver pan-fried with wild onions Ben had preserved from autumn. The cabin felt warm and secure, a small pocket of civilization carved from the wilderness through sheer determination. "You did good during the storm," Ben said unexpectedly. Didn't panic, didn't complain, just worked. That's what it takes to survive up here. From Ben, this was practically a speech. Sarah felt warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. I had good teachers, she replied. You had the raw material, Jacob corrected. We just showed you how to use it. There's a difference between teaching someone skills and teaching someone who's determined to learn them. The conversation drifted to other topics, plans for repairing the barn properly, whether they should expand the trap line, what supplies they'd need to bring up before next winter. Sarah listened and contributed. Realizing she was part of the planning now, her opinions valued. Her experience limited as it was considered legitimate. Later, as she lay in her curtained alcove, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin settling, Sarah thought about how far she'd come. 3 months ago, she'd been a frightened girl fleeing her father's contempt. Now she was someone who could survive a 6-day blizzard, butcher an elk, and look at 20 feet of snow as an obstacle to overcome rather than an insurmountable disaster. She pulled out her mother's medicine pouch and held it close, thinking about Nashoda, who'd survived in these mountains with tools far more primitive than Sarah possessed. Her mother had thrived here, been respected as a healer, built a life despite the hardships. That blood ran in Sarah's veins. That strength was her inheritance. Sleep came easy these days. The exhaustion of honest work, replacing the anxious wakefulness that had plagued her at the ranch. She dreamed of spring, of green returning to the valley, of the person she might become when winter finally released its grip. The following weeks brought new challenges. They had to re-establish the entire trap line, wading through snow so deep it sometimes reached Sarah's waist, even with snowshoes. The traps they'd carefully placed before the storm were buried, requiring hours of excavation. Some were damaged beyond repair, crushed by fallen trees or torn apart by desperate animals. Game was scarce. The storm had forced everything into hiding, and what did emerge moved in patterns that no longer matched their trap placements. They had to adapt, learning to read the new landscape, finding where the animals had relocated their trails and dens. During one of these scouting expeditions, Sarah encountered her first mountain lion. She was checking a trap near the northern edge of their territory when she felt it, that primitive awareness of being watched by something dangerous. She froze, her hand moving slowly to her rifle. The big cat sat on a boulder 20 yards away, its tawny coat nearly invisible against the winter bare rock, its eyes fixed on her with predatory intelligence. For a long moment, neither moved. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel sweat forming despite the cold. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew that would trigger the cat's chase response. Instead, she did what Jacob had taught her, made herself large, raised her arms, and spoke in a firm, loud voice. "Get out of here. Go on, get." The cougar's ears flattened. It rose slowly, muscles rippling under its fur. Sarah's finger found her rifle's trigger, knowing she'd get one shot if the cat charged, praying she wouldn't need to take it. Then the cougar turned and leaped from the boulder, disappearing into the forest with fluid grace. Sarah stood there for several minutes after it vanished, her legs shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally moved, it was to mark the location carefully. They'd need to avoid this area for a while. Give the cat space to hunt elsewhere, back at the cabin. When she told Jacob and Ben what had happened, neither seemed surprised. "Cougars are curious," Jacob explained. "Probably sizing you up, deciding if you were prey or threat. You did exactly right. Didn't run. Made yourself intimidating. Gave it an escape route. Shows you've been paying attention." "Felt more like terror than strategy," Sarah admitted. "Fear keeps you alive," Ben said. "It's when you stop being afraid that you make fatal mistakes. Never lose that edge." As December gave way to January, the deep cold settled in permanently. Temperatures dropped so low that breath froze instantly, that metal burned to touch. That water thrown in the air turned to ice crystals before hitting the ground. This was the heart of winter, the test that separated the prepared from the doomed. But Sarah's earlier fear had transformed into something else. Not confidence exactly, but competence. She knew what needed doing and how to do it. She could read the weather, track game, maintain equipment, and endure the brutal cold. The mountains had tested her and found her adequate, which was all anyone could ask. One evening, as they sat around the fire mending torn clothing, Jacob spoke up. "We'll need to make a supply run in February, once the worst cold breaks. Town's probably wondering if we survive the big storm." "I'll go with you," Ben said immediately. Jacob shook his head. "One of us needs to stay here, keep the traps running. Sarah should come, she's earned it. Besides, people need to see that she's thriving, that leaving her father's house was the best decision she ever made." Sarah's hands stilled on the shirt she was patching. She hadn't thought about returning to Timber Ridge, hadn't considered facing the people who'd scorned her. Part of her wanted to refuse, to stay safely hidden in the mountains. But another part, the part that had survived the storm and faced down a cougar, wanted to show them exactly what they'd underestimated. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll go." Jacob smiled, that rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "Good, because I have a feeling your father's in for quite a surprise when he sees what his half-breed trash has become." Outside, the wind howled across the valley, carrying with it the promise of more storms to come. But inside the cabin, with the fire burning warm and the company good, Sarah felt something she'd never known in all her years at her father's ranch. She felt like she'd finally come home. February brought the thaw. Jacob had promised not warmth exactly, but a softening of winter's cruelest edge. The sun climbed higher each day, and occasional Chinook winds swept down from the peaks, melting the top layer of snow into treacherous slush. It was in this transitional season, when the land hung suspended between winter and spring, that Sarah and Jacob prepared for their journey to Timber Ridge. Ben watched them pack with ill-concealed skepticism. "You're taking her back to face those people? Why?" "She doesn't owe them anything, least of all proof she survived." "It's not about them," Jacob replied, securing bundles of prime pelts to his horse. "It's about her. Sarah needs to close that chapter, see it from where she stands now instead of where she was." Sarah checked her rifle for the third time, a nervous habit she'd developed. The weapon felt different, now not like the borrowed tool it had been in autumn, but like an extension of her own body. Everything about her had changed, really. Her hands were harder, her shoulders broader from months of physical labor. Her face had bronzed from sun and wind, and her eyes had acquired the far-seeing quality of people who spent their days scanning distant horizons for game or weather. "I'm not afraid of them anymore," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. But Jacob's right. I need to see it finished. The journey down from High Valley took 2 days, following trails that were barely passable through the melting snow. They camped one night in a grove of aspens, and Sarah found herself staring at the stars, remembering the last time she'd made this trip, a frightened girl running from rejection, uncertain if she was fleeing toward salvation or destruction. "You've been quiet," Jacob observed, prodding the campfire with a stick. "Just thinking about how different everything is now." Sarah pulled her coat tighter against the night chill. "When I left, I felt like I was nothing. Like my father was right about me. And now? Now I know he was wrong about everything that matters." She met Jacob's eyes across the fire. "You told me I was twice the woman you needed. I didn't believe you then. I thought you were just being kind." "I wasn't being kind," Jacob said firmly. "I was being accurate. You proved it every day since during the storm, on the trap line, facing down that cougar. You've got steel in you. Sarah, your father's too blind to see it, but that's his loss. Not yours." They rode into Timber Ridge just after noon. when the main street was crowded with people conducting midday business. Sarah sat straight in her saddle, acutely aware of how she must look buckskins instead of calico, rifle across her back. Confidence in her bearing that hadn't existed 5 months ago. The reactions were immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People stared openly, some with surprise, others with something that looked almost like respect. Sarah recognized most of them: Mrs. Green with her daughters, Frank Morrison loading supplies into his wagon, old Pete Sanderson leaning against the livery stable. They all saw her, but none seemed to know quite what to make of her transformation. "Is that Sarah Dalton?" she heard someone whisper. "Can't be. That girl looks like she could wrestle a bear." "It is her. Look at those eyes." Jacob led them straight to the trading post, where they tied their horses and began unloading pelts. Mr. Hutchinson emerged, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Jacob! And Miss Sarah, good Lord, girl, look at you." He hurried over, clasping her hand warmly. "We heard about that monster storm up north. Feared the worst when no one came down for supplies in January. We were snowed in for 6 weeks after the initial blizzard," Sarah explained. "Couldn't move until the trails cleared, but you survived." Hutchinson's voice held admiration. "Not many could say that. Come inside, both of you. Let's see what you've brought to trade." The trading post was warm and crowded, smelling of coffee and tobacco and the peculiar mix of goods that defined frontier commerce. Jacob spread their pelts across the counter: beaver, marten, fox, even 2 prime wolf hides. Hutchinson examined each one with professional expertise, occasionally making notes in his ledger. "This is exceptional work," he said, running his fingers across a beaver pelt. "Clean skinning, proper stretching, good preservation. Jacob, I know these are your usual quality, but this one," he held up a marten pelt, "this is even better. Different hand, I'd wager." "Sarah's work," Jacob confirmed. "She's got a talent for it." Hutchinson looked at Sarah with new appreciation. "You've learned a valuable trade, Miss Sarah. These pelts will fetch top dollar in Denver. I can offer you," he calculated quickly, $240 for the lot. "That's a fair market price, and I'll throw in your supply order at cost." It was more money than Sarah had ever held at once. She watched Jacob negotiate the final details, learning this skill too: how to assess value, when to push for better terms, how to maintain relationships while still getting fair compensation. While Jacob finalized their supply order, Sarah wandered the store's aisles. Everything felt smaller than she remembered, more confined. The goods that had once seemed exotic now looked ordinary compared to the vast wilderness she'd spent months navigating. She was examining a display of patent medicines when a voice cut through the ambient noise. "Well, well, the prodigal daughter returns." Sarah turned to find Douglas Finch standing behind her, his expression hovering between amusement and contempt. Up close, she could smell whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "Mr. Finch," she acknowledged neutrally. "Heard you ran off with that mountain man. Your father was apoplectic, not because he missed you, mind, but because it made him look bad. Can't control his own half-breed daughter. What kind of man does that make him?" Finch stepped closer, invading her space. "Course, some of us figured you'd come crawling back once winter hit. Guessed you'd realize how good you had it at the ranch." Sarah felt Jacob move up behind her, a silent presence of support, but she didn't need him to fight this battle. She met Finch's eyes steadily, seeing him now for what he was: a small, bitter man who built himself up by tearing others down. "You're right about one thing," she said calmly. "I did realize something this winter. I realized that spending every day working until my hands bled, hunting my own food, and surviving storms that would kill softer people is infinitely preferable to spending one more minute seeking approval from men like you or my father." Finch's face reddened. "You've got a mouth on you now, girl. Your father should have beaten that out of you when you were young." My father, Sarah said, her voice dropping to something cold and dangerous, didn't have the courage to love me or the decency to let me go with grace. He's a coward who measures his worth by his wife's approval and the respect of people whose opinions aren't worth the air used to speak them. And you, Mr. Finch, are exactly the same, a weak man who mistakes cruelty for strength. The trading post had gone silent. Everyone was watching now, witnessing this confrontation. Finch's hand moved toward his belt, and Sarah saw Jacob tense, but she remained perfectly still. You threatening me, Finch? She asked quietly. Because I faced down mountain lions and blizzards. You think you scare me? For a moment, real violence hung in the air. Then Tom Barrett, the livery owner, stepped between them. That's enough, Douglas. You've had too much to drink. Go sleep it off. Finch glared at Sarah for another long moment, then spat on the floor and stalked out. The tension broke, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Sarah's hands were shaking, but her voice had been steady. That counted for something. You made an enemy there, Hutchinson said quietly. I made that enemy the day I was born, Sarah replied. At least now he knows I'm not afraid of him. They completed their business quickly after that, loading their horses with flour, coffee, ammunition, and other supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Sarah was ready to leave when Reverend Thomas appeared, slightly out of breath from hurrying. Miss Sarah, I heard you were in town. I wanted to, that is, I hoped to. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I wanted to apologize. When you left, I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in family matters. But I should have done more. Should have offered you sanctuary, or at least spoken to your father about Christian charity and duty. Sarah studied the Reverend's face, seeing genuine regret there. Would it have changed anything? Probably not, he admitted. But I should have tried. Your mother Nashoda was a good woman. Healed my predecessor when he took sick with a fever. Saved his life. I should have honored that memory by protecting you. I don't need protection anymore, Reverend, Sarah said gently. But I appreciate the sentiment. As they prepared to ride out, Sarah caught sight of her stepmother across the street. Claire stood outside the general store, a basket on her arm, staring at Sarah with an expression that mixed shock with something else, possibly envy, possibly fear. For a moment, their eyes met. Sarah nodded once, a gesture that conveyed neither forgiveness nor hostility, simply acknowledgement and dismissal. Claire looked away first, hurrying back into the store as if chased. Want to ride past the ranch? Jacob asked as they headed toward the edge of town. See the old place one last time? Sarah considered this, then shook her head. No point. That was never my home. High Valley is where I belong now. They were almost out of town when a rider intercepted them. Young man Sarah vaguely recognized as one of her father's ranch hands. He pulled up, his horse breathing hard. Miss Sarah? Your father, he wants to see you. Says it's important. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She owed Marcus Dalton nothing. But curiosity won out. Where? The ranch. He's waiting there now. Jacob gave her a questioning look, and Sarah shrugged. Might as well finish this properly. The ranch looked exactly as she remembered, the weathered house. The barn she'd worked in countless mornings. The fields where she'd toiled for people who never valued her labor. But seeing it now felt like viewing a photograph of someone else's life. These buildings held no power over her anymore. Marcus Dalton stood on the porch, and Sarah was shocked by how much he'd aged in just 5 months. His hair had gone entirely gray. His shoulders seemed stooped, his face deeply lined. He watched them approach with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Sarah, he said as she dismounted. His voice was different, too smaller somehow, less certain. You came. Your man said it was important. Sarah stood at the bottom of the porch steps, making no move to come closer. What do you want? Marcus glanced at Jacob, who remained mounted, his hand resting casually on his rifle. "Could we speak privately? Anything you need to say, you can say in front of Jacob. He's more family to me than you ever were." Her father flinched at that, but nodded. "Fair enough. I suppose I deserve that." He descended the steps slowly, as if his joints pained him. "I heard what you said to Douglas Finch about me being a coward. You were listening?" Word travels fast in a small town. Marcus stopped a few feet away. "And you're right. I was a coward. I loved your mother, Sarah, loved her desperately. But I was too weak to stand against my own people, too concerned with what others thought to protect what mattered." Sarah felt her throat tighten but kept her voice level. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Claire left me." Marcus gave a bitter laugh. 3 weeks ago. Went back to Boston. Said she couldn't stand living with a man who'd lost his daughter's respect and gained a reputation for cruelty. Turns out the society she cared so much about found my treatment of you unacceptable. Ironic, isn't it? What do you want, Father? Forgiveness? Reconciliation? I want you to know that I was wrong." Marcus's voice cracked. "About everything. You're not trash, Sarah. You never were. You're strong and capable, and everything I should have celebrated instead of hiding. Your mother would have been proud of the woman you've become. And he paused, wiping his eyes roughly. "I'm proud too, though I've forfeited any right to say so." Sarah stood silent, processing this. Part of her, the wounded child who'd craved her father's approval, wanted to weep, to embrace him, to pretend the years of rejection could be erased with words. But she was no longer that child. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "It means something to hear it. But it doesn't change anything, Father. The damage is done. You can't unsay the things you said, undo the things you did. I've built a new life, and there's no place in it for you." "I understand." Marcus nodded heavily. "But if you ever need anything, money, supplies, help of any kind, I won't." Sarah cut him off, not cruelly but firmly. "I don't need your guilt money. I've made my own way, earned my own respect. That's worth more than anything you could offer now." She mounted her horse, looking down at the man who'd given her life but refused to give her love. "Goodbye, Father. I hope you find peace with your choices, because I found mine." As they rode away, Jacob spoke quietly. "That must have been hard." "It was necessary," Sarah corrected. "He needed to say his piece, and I needed to hear that I was right to leave. Some doors need to close completely before you can move forward." They made camp that night at the same aspen grove, their last stop before the final push to High Valley. Sarah sat by the fire, thinking about the day's events, Finch's hostility, the Reverend's apology, her father's belated recognition. All of it felt distant now, like scenes from a play she'd watched rather than lived. "You handled yourself well today," Jacob said, pouring coffee. "Stood your ground without losing your temper. That takes maturity. I learned from the best." Sarah accepted the cup gratefully. "You and Ben taught me that respect has to be earned, not demanded. My father demanded respect but never earned it. That's why his words meant nothing in the end." "What about his apology? Did it mean nothing?" Sarah considered this carefully. "It meant he finally saw me as a person. That's not nothing. But it doesn't obligate me to anything. I can acknowledge his regret without forgiving what he did, or resuming a relationship that was toxic." Jacob smiled. "You've come a long way from the scared girl I met on Widow's Peak." "That girl's not gone," Sarah said honestly. "She's just learned she's stronger than she thought. The mountains taught me that, when you face something that could kill you every single day, the opinions of small-minded people lose their power." They reached High Valley the next afternoon, the cabin appearing like a beacon of home. Ben emerged as they rode up, his weathered face breaking into something almost like a smile. "About time you got back. I was starting to think that town had poisoned you with its civilization." "Never," Sarah laughed, dismounting. "Though they do have actual bread that doesn't require chewing like leather." "That's because they're soft," Ben replied, but his eyes held warmth. "Good to have you back, girl." That night, they shared the gossip from town and the supplies they'd brought back. Sarah found herself telling them about the confrontation with Finch, her father's apology, the way people had stared at her transformation. "You showed them who you really are," Ben said. "That matters, does it?" Sarah asked. "Do I need their validation?" "No," Jacob said firmly. "You don't need it. But they need to see it, need to understand that the person they dismissed became someone extraordinary. Not for revenge, but because it challenges their assumptions. Makes them question who else they've underestimated." Sarah thought about this as she lay in her curtained alcove that night. Tomorrow she'd wake before dawn and check the trapline. She'd hunt and process game and maintain equipment and do all the 100 tasks that kept them alive in the wilderness. It was hard work, dangerous work, work that demanded everything she had got. It was also the most honest life she'd ever lived. She pulled out her mother's medicine pouch, holding it as she often did before sleep. "I did it, Mother," she whispered into the darkness. "I survived. I became strong. I found people who see my worth instead of my origins." Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, and another answered from a different ridge. Sarah smiled, recognizing the sounds now, a mated pair calling to each other, maintaining contact across the valley. Even in the wilderness, connection existed. Family could be chosen, not just inherited. As she drifted towards sleep, Sarah thought about Jacob's words from that first day. "She's twice the woman I need." At the time, she'd thought he was exaggerating, offering false comfort to someone desperate for kindness. Now she understood. He hadn't been measuring her against some impossible standard. He'd been seeing potential she couldn't recognize in herself, the strength that came from surviving rejection, the resilience born from being caught between worlds, the determination of someone who'd had to fight for every scrap of belonging. Her father had called her half-breed trash, as if being of mixed heritage made her less than human. But Jacob had seen the truth. Being half of two worlds made her capable of thriving in both. She could track like her mother's people and shoot like her father's. She could survive in the wilderness and navigate civilization. She carried the best of both legacies, and that made her not half of anything, it made her whole. The mountains had tested her and found her worthy. That was the only validation that mattered. Sarah Dalton fell asleep in her chosen home, surrounded by her chosen family, and dreamed of spring, when the snow would melt and the valley would turn green and the future would spread before her like an unwritten story, ready to be filled with whatever adventures she dared to pursue. She'd left timber ridge as a frightened girl fleeing rejection. She'd returned as a woman who'd learned the most important lesson the wilderness could teach. Survival isn't about being the strongest or the toughest. It's about being adaptable, resilient, and brave enough to choose your own path, regardless of what others think you deserve. And Sarah Dalton had chosen well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.